Rancher, is your mind always between my legs? Is that why you ordered me? The woman's voice was steady as iron. She stood a full 6 feet tall in her traveling boots, the dust from the stagecoach still settling around her like a shroud. Her shadow stretched long and accusing across the porch boards. Because if you think you bought yourself a workhorse instead of a wife, we need to settle this right now. Samuel's weathered face flushed a deep, painful red, but it wasn't from her boldness. It was shame, pure, hot shame, because he knew exactly what she was talking about, even though he'd never seen the words himself. He had written for companionship, for a voice to break the crushing silence. He never imagined the marriage broker's cruel, clinical description would reach her first. The paper in her hand trembled, a single leaf in a storm, but her voice held firm. She read from it, her tone laced with a fury so cold it could freeze fire. Says right here, hardy stock, built for labor, wide-shouldered specimen, suitable for ranch work. She took a step closer, and the space between them crackled. Samuel could smell the faint scent of lavender soap fighting a losing battle against 3 days of trail dust. He could see the exhaustion etched around her eyes, but underneath it, a fire burned. They wrote about me like I was cattle, she said, her voice dropping to a low growl. And you paid for it. Samuel's throat worked twice before any sound came out. His own voice was a stranger to him, rusty from disuse. I never saw that paper. Her eyes, green as the hardy grass that only grew after flash floods, narrowed in disbelief. But you paid the fee. I paid before they wrote that, he insisted, his hands, scarred and calloused from 20 years of rope burns and ranch work, opening helplessly at his sides. It was a gesture of utter surrender, of a man with no defenses left. My letter just asked for someone who wouldn't mind the loneliness, someone who could handle the wind when it screams all winter. He trailed off, unable to say the words she was thinking. He couldn't finish the sentence. Someone who wouldn't mind a giant, she supplied, the word dropping like a stone into the thick, simmering desert heat. It hung there between them, ugly and undeniable. Behind her, the stagecoach driver was already turning his team of weary horses, eager to get back on the trail before the sun bled out behind the mountains. He wasn't sticking around for the aftermath. Soon, the only witnesses to this train wreck of a meeting would be the old, half-blind dog sleeping on the porch and the ancient mountains that had seen 1,000 years of heartbreak, just like this. Samuel finally managed to lift his gaze and meet hers. The shame was still there, but something else was rising underneath it. A desperate, ragged honesty. No, he said, his voice cracking like dry leather. I asked for someone strong enough to stay. That stopped her. The rigid anger in her shoulders seemed to falter, just for a second. The word hung in the air, heavier even than giant. Stay. 3 wives before you, he confessed, the words torn from him, each one a fresh wound. The first one, she took a fever, quick and brutal. The second took the eastbound stage after one winter, said the silence out here was louder than any city. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. He looked away, toward the jagged peaks that clawed at the sky. The third one. He paused, and the air grew thick with unspoken tragedy. The third one. She took her own life, rather than spend another season alone while I drove cattle to Kansas. The giant woman, Margaret, her name was Margaret, he'd learned it from the single hopeful letter she had sent. Slowly, deliberately, set down her heavy carpet bag. It hit the porch with a solid thud, the sound of a life's possessions making their final stand. She looked at him, really looked at him then. She saw the gray threading through hair that had once been as black as a raven's wing. She saw the way he stood slightly askew, favoring the hip a wild Mustang had shattered 3 seasons back. She saw the clean but faded shirt he'd put on just for her. She could even see the faint fold marks where it had been stored away, waiting for an occasion that might never come. He had tried. For her, he had tried to look good. "And you think I'm different because I'm built like a barn door?" she asked, her voice softer now, the sharp edges worn down by his brutal honesty. "I think you're different because you're still here," he answered, his voice quiet but firm. "That broker," Samuel said, his eyes finding a loose nail on the porch to stare at. "He came through here last spring, found me drunk after a long week of branding. I was feeling low. I told him I needed someone who wouldn't break." His voice caught, thick with emotion. "I meant heart-wise. I meant someone whose spirit wouldn't shatter when November comes howling down from the mountains, and the only sound for 100 miles is the wind and the lowing of dying cattle." Margaret felt something in her chest, a painful knot she'd been carrying for years, loosen just a little. She remembered her own family 6 months ago, pushing a newspaper with circled advertisements into her hands. "No man here will have you, Margaret," her mother had said, her eyes refusing to meet her daughter's, flitting away from her height, from the breadth of her shoulders that could carry 2 sacks of feed as easily as other women carried infants. "You're not delicate. Maybe out west they won't mind. Maybe out west." It was a phrase that meant hope for some, and a scrap heap for others. And now, here she was, standing in front of a man who was apologizing for words he hadn't written, while she was still nursing an anger for wounds he hadn't inflicted. The whole world felt off kilter. "You got coffee?" she asked abruptly. The question cut through the heavy silence. Samuel blinked, thrown by the sudden shift. "Coffee?" "It's been 3 days of dust and bad beans," she stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "If we're going to stand here and argue about whether I'm your wife or your new ox, I'm going to need coffee. Strong coffee." For the first time, he moved with something approaching speed, his bad hip be damned. He practically lunged for the cabin door, holding it open for her. The inside of the cabin was what she expected. Clean, but desperately sparse. 1 wooden chair at the table, 1 tin plate on the shelf, 1 cup hanging from a hook. It was a room that screamed loneliness. It was a place where the idea of 2 had died a long, slow death. Margaret paused on the threshold, the setting sun at her back, casting her long shadow across the entire room. "You should know something, Samuel." He waited, his hand still on the door, his posture expectant. "I didn't come here because I had nowhere else to go," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I came because of your letter, the one you actually wrote. It said you knew what it was like to be too much for the world, but not enough for it at the same time." The words struck him like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his face a mask of shock. He remembered writing that line, remembered the cheap whiskey that had given him the courage to be that honest, to send that small, desperate piece of himself out into the world, hoping someone, somewhere, would understand. And someone had. Margaret stepped inside, having to duck her head slightly to clear the doorframe. She looked around the Spartan room, her gaze taking in the single bed, the empty shelves, the cold fireplace. This was the heart of his loneliness. "Make it strong," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet cabin. She was talking about the coffee, but they both knew she meant something more. "Strong enough to wash the taste of that broker's words out of both our mouths." The coffee was strong enough to strip paint from a barn door, and Margaret drank it like a potent medicine. Outside, the sun finally gave up its fight, sinking behind the jagged mountains and painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, the color of an old bruise and a new promise. Samuel sat across from her on an overturned wooden crate he'd dragged from a dark corner. The single chair problem was solved, for now. Between them, on the small, rough-hewn table, sat 2 steaming cups and the weight of a combined lifetime of solitude. "That hip's going to give you hell come winter," Margaret said, her voice flat, an observation, not a question. She watched the way he unconsciously shifted his weight, trying to find a position that didn't send a jolt of pain up his spine. "Been giving me hell for 3 winters now," he admitted with a shrug. "You never had it looked at proper? Nearest doctor is a 2-day ride," he said, as if that explained everything. "Can't leave the cattle that long." Margaret set down her cup with a decisive click that seemed to make a decision for both of them. "I know bone setting, learned it from my grandmother." Samuel looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "She was the town midwife," Margaret continued, her gaze turning inward, looking at a memory that still had sharp edges. "For 30 years. Then—" She trailed off, and a shadow passed across her face, so dark and sudden, it was as if a cloud had covered the sun. Before she got too old, before her hands started to shake, a baby was born wrong, and it died. And the whole town, the people whose children she had brought into the world, they decided she was cursed. They forgot the 30 years of life. They only remembered the one death. They decided she was cursed instead of just human. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with a grim understanding, the kind that only people who have carried the unjust weight of blame can ever truly know. Samuel pushed himself up from his crate, the movement stiff and painful. He walked to the single window, peering out into the twilight. His cattle, dark shapes in the fading light, were moving toward the barn, guided by the instinct of routine and the promise of water. "You see that brindle cow?" he asked, his voice low. "The one with the torn ear?" Margaret came to stand beside him. She was so close now that he could feel the warmth radiating from her, the residual heat of a long day's travel. Her presence filled the small space beside him, a solid, comforting reality. "I see her," Margaret said. "Found her 2 springs back," Samuel went on, his eyes fixed on the animal. "Her leg was broken, tangled in wire. Vultures were circling. Everyone I knew, they all said to shoot her. Said she'd never walk right, never breed. Said she was a waste of good feed." He watched as the brindle cow moved with a slow, deliberate limp toward the water trough. She was favoring her leg, but she was moving forward. "She's given me the 3 best calves I've ever had," he said softly. "Turns out broken doesn't always mean worthless." In the dusty glass of the window pane, their reflections overlapped. Her height made them almost even, 2 tall, solitary figures against the darkening landscape. "Is that why you really wrote for a wife?" Margaret asked, her voice quiet but piercing. "To find another broken thing you could fix?" "No." The word was quick, sharp, and brutally honest. He turned from the window to face her, the last of the light catching the deep lines around his eyes. "I wrote because I'm tired of talking to cattle. I wrote because I'm tired of making coffee for one man. I wrote because I'm tired of waking up in the morning and wondering if anyone in the whole damn world would even notice if I didn't." The confession hung in the air, raw and exposed. Margaret's composure, the iron wall she had built around herself, seemed to crack. The small cabin suddenly felt even smaller, charged with the weight of his words. "What if I'm not what you expected?" she whispered. "You're not," he confirmed, holding her gaze. This woman, who could look him straight in the eye without tilting her head, was nothing like he'd imagined. "I expected someone who would need me. I didn't expect someone who might actually choose me." "I haven't chosen anything yet," she reminded him, but the defensive edge in her voice was gone, replaced by something softer, more uncertain. "I know," he said. He moved to the shelf and took down the second plate. It was coated in a thin layer of dust, a relic from a time when he hadn't yet given up on hope. "But you're here, and that's a damn sight more than I had this morning." Margaret watched him as he walked to the wash basin and began to rinse the plate. He moved with a careful, thorough precision, as if this small act was the most important thing in the world, as if she mattered. "My mother," Margaret said to his back. Told me no man would ever want a woman who could carry him over her shoulder. Samuel didn't turn around, but he paused his washing. Your mother was wrong. You don't know that, she challenged. You don't know if I could carry you. A small, almost smile touched Samuel's lips, the first she had seen. He turned, the clean plate in his hand. Margaret, I've seen the way you walk. You move like a woman who's been carrying the entire world on her back for years and is just getting tired of the weight. I don't need you to carry me. He walked back to the table and set the clean plate down next to the first one. 2 of everything now. The sight was so simple, yet it struck Margaret with the force of a revelation. Just, he said, his voice dropping low. Just stay for dinner. Let me prove that broker was wrong, about both of us. She studied him for a long, silent moment. This man with his broken hip and his careful hands. This man who had lost 3 wives to the harshness of this land but had still put on a clean shirt for a 4th. This man who saw her strength not as a flaw, but as a sign that she had survived. What are we having? She asked. Beans and salt pork. She raised an eyebrow. Is that all you know how to make? That and coffee strong enough to raise the dead? Pretty much, he admitted, a faint flush rising on his neck. Then I'll cook, she declared. She moved toward the small cast-iron stove, and Samuel instinctively stepped aside to let her pass. As she did, her hand brushed against his. It wasn't an accident, but it wasn't quite a promise either. It was just a possibility, a flicker of warmth in the cold, lonely cabin. Margaret opened his supply shelf and let out a small, weary sigh. The contents were as sparse as the rest of the cabin. Beans, salt pork, flour, lard, and coffee. And tucked in the very back, almost hidden, was a single can of peaches. It looked like it had been there for years, saved for a special occasion that had never arrived. She took it down. That's for, Samuel started, a note of protest in his voice. For your new wife, if she stayed. Margaret finished for him. She didn't wait for an answer. With 3 efficient, powerful moves of a knife she produced from her bag, she opened the can. The sweet, syrupy smell of peaches filled the small cabin, a startling wave of sweetness in a world of dust and loneliness. Well, she said, her back to him as she began to work. I'm here through dinner at least. Might as well find out if you're worth dessert. Samuel watched her, mesmerized. This giant of a woman was making his small, empty space feel not cramped, but complete. She moved with a practiced, careful grace, the way a person learns to move when they've spent their entire life in a world built for smaller people. But here, in this cabin he had built with his own 2 hands, with its high rafters designed to accommodate his own tall frame, she didn't have to duck. She didn't have to squeeze through doorways. She didn't have to apologize for the space she took up. Why'd you build the ceiling so high? She asked, not turning around, as if she could feel his thoughts. He was startled by her perception. I'm 6'2" in my boots, he answered simply. Got tired of hitting my head in my own home. She stopped what she was doing and turned to look at him then. Really, look at him. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed her features. So you built a place where you could stand up tall? Yes, he said. And now, she said, her smile widening, there are 2 of us who can. The words hung in the air between them, a gift that neither of them had expected to give or receive. A simple truth that changed the very shape of the room. Dinner wasn't just beans. It was a miracle. Margaret had found a patch of wild onions growing behind the cabin and a small sack of cornmeal tucked away behind the lard. She'd worked some kind of magic, transforming the simple, bleak ingredients into a meal that tasted like hope. Samuel ate slowly, not out of manners, but because he wanted to make it last forever. He wanted to savor every bite, every moment of not being alone. Across from him, Margaret ate with a steady, focused gratitude, the way a person does when they've learned not to trust that there will always be more. But her eyes were constantly scanning the cabin, taking in every detail. She wasn't just eating, she was gathering information. "You weren't always alone here," she said suddenly. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. Her gaze was fixed on the rough-hewn doorframe. Samuel's hand, which was halfway to his mouth with a spoonful of beans, froze in midair. He knew what she was looking at. The faint pencil marks, marching their way up the wood, child-sized heights, with years scrawled beside them. He set his spoon down, the clatter unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He placed it on the table with the same care a man might use to handle a piece of broken glass. "My brother," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He lived here with me, had a wife, 2 boys. He took a deep, shaky breath. Cholera. Took them all. 1 week, 6 years back. I was in Kansas, on a cattle drive. Came home to 4 fresh graves and a house that had gone silent." Margaret didn't offer any empty words of comfort. She knew better. She knew that some wounds are too deep for platitudes. Instead, she asked a question that cut straight to the bone. "Is that why you keep driving the cattle? To make sure you're away when things might die?" The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. He had never thought of it that way, but now, hearing it from her, it felt undeniably true. He ran away to Kansas every year, not just for the money, but to escape the ghosts that haunted this land. "Maybe," he whispered, the admission costing him more than he could say. "Can't blame you," she said, pushing her chair back and starting to clear the plates. As she moved around the table, she spoke again. "I spent 2 years as a traveling teacher, went from family to family, teaching their children how to read and write. Never stayed in one place long enough to watch them grow up." Her voice was steady, but Samuel heard the words she didn't say. She never stayed long enough to watch them grow, or not grow. He heard the ghosts in her past, too. The children who never learned to read because of fever, or accident, or just the relentless hardness of life on the frontier. He stood to help her, and as they both reached for the same cup, their hands met. A current of warmth passed between them. This time, neither of them pulled away. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said, her voice dropping lower, her eyes fixed on their joined hands. "About why I really answered your advertisement." Samuel waited, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The single lamp on the table flickered, sending shadows dancing across her strong, expressive face. "There was a man back home," she began. "His name was Jacob. Everyone in town just assumed we'd end up together. We were the odd ones, you see. Him with his twisted foot from a childhood accident, and me with—" She gestured vaguely at her own tall frame. "Well, with me." She pulled her hand away and began to pace the small space in front of the fireplace. "But he didn't marry me. He married the prettiest, most delicate girl in the whole county. Said he'd rather have something beautiful to look at over his breakfast, even if she couldn't help him with the real farm work." "The man was a fool," Samuel said, the words coming out as a low growl. "That's what I thought too," Margaret said, stopping her pacing to face him. "I thought he was the biggest fool in the world. Until I saw them together. The way he looked at her, it was like she was the sunrise. Like she was Christmas and the spring thaw and the harvest moon all rolled into one. And I realized—" Her voice went soft with a remembered pain. "I realized I would rather be alone for the rest of my life than be with a man who settled for me just because I was useful." Samuel moved around the table until he was standing directly in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back slightly to look him in the eye. "I didn't advertise for useful," he said, his voice raw with an intensity that stunned her. "I advertised for alive, for someone who hadn't given up yet, for someone who still believed that a new morning could matter. He reached out, his calloused hand moving with the slow, deliberate caution of a man approaching a spooked horse. He didn't touch her face, not yet. He just barely grazed the ends of her hair, where the lamplight turned it the color of burnished copper. "The first thing I noticed about you, Margaret, wasn't your height," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It was that you were angry. Angry means you still care about being treated right. Angry means you haven't given up hope that you deserve better. It means you're still fighting." Tears threatened then, hot and unwelcome, blurring his face into a hazy watercolor. She fought them back, blinking furiously. "Don't," she whispered, her voice choked. "Don't what?" "Don't be kind to me unless you mean it," she pleaded. "I can take cruel. I've had a lifetime of it, but I can't take a kindness that gets taken back." His hand moved from her hair to her face, his rough thumb gently tracing the path where a single tear had escaped and fallen. The touch was electric, a jolt of human connection so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. "It has been 6 years," he said, his voice thick with a profound, aching loneliness, "since I touched another person on purpose. 6 years since I had a reason to be gentle. I'm out of practice at being kind, Margaret, but I promise you this, I'm not false with it." She leaned into his palm, a small, tentative movement, like testing the ice on a frozen lake before committing her full weight. The warmth of his hand against her skin was both a comfort and a terror. "The stage comes back through in 3 days," she said, the words a test, a warning. "I could leave then, if this isn't right." "I know," he said, his thumb continuing its slow, mesmerizing path along her cheekbone. He dropped his hand then, but he didn't step back. He held his ground and he held her gaze. "That gives me 3 days to prove we're both worth staying for." Outside, the night had fully descended, blanketing the land in a deep, star-dusted velvet. The cattle were settled, their soft breathing a quiet rhythm in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote sang its song of solitude to the moon. Inside the small, lamplit cabin, 2 people stood in a circle of golden light, both too tall for most of the world's doorways, both too broken for most of the world's hearts, and both, against all odds, still somehow willing to try. "I snore," Margaret said suddenly, the words bursting out of her, loud and ungraceful. "Like a sawmill," my father used to say. Samuel just watched her, his expression unreadable. "And I talk in my sleep," she added, the confession tumbling out now. "Full conversations, with people who have been dead for years." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the final, most painful admission. "And I can't carry children. My first husband and I, we tried for 3 years before he took the fever. Nothing ever took hold." She braced herself for the pity, the disappointment, the gentle rejection she was sure would follow. It was the final, fatal flaw that had made her unworthy in the eyes of the world, a woman who couldn't fulfill her primary purpose. Samuel was quiet for a long, agonizing moment. The silence stretched, and Margaret's heart began to sink. This was it, the deal breaker. Then he spoke a single word. "Good." She pulled back, her face a mask of shocked confusion. "Good? What do you mean, good?" "Good," he repeated, his voice firm, resolute. He looked past her, toward the doorframe with the faint pencil marks. "I buried 2 nephews, Margaret. I raised them from when they were babies. I taught them how to ride and fish. I loved them like they were my own sons. And I buried them." His voice cracked, the sound of a man breaking apart and putting himself back together in the same breath. "I can't do it again. I can't put any more children in that ground. If that makes me selfish or broken or less of a man, then so be it. But I cannot bury another child." The confession hung between them, more raw and intimate than any physical touch. Margaret understood then. She understood everything. He hadn't written for a wife to give him an heir, to build a legacy, or even just to help with the endless work of the ranch. He had written for a wife who could fill the silence without adding to the graves. "Then we're matched," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Both of us too damaged for what the world expects." "Maybe," Samuel said, moving back to the window and staring out at the impenetrable darkness. "Or maybe we're just damaged enough to finally understand that surviving isn't the same thing as living." Margaret joined him at the window. In the dark glass, their reflections merged, two tall, solitary figures becoming a single unified shadow. The image was startling, and it felt right. "So," she asked, her voice quiet but steady, "how do we learn to live, instead of just survive?" He turned to her, the darkness outside throwing his face into sharp relief. "I don't know," he admitted, his honesty a balm on her own wounded soul. "But I'd like to try and learn, with someone who doesn't have to duck to get through my front door. And despite everything, the grief, the loneliness, the lifetime of being made to feel wrong." Margaret laughed. The sound was sudden and startling, a joyful, unexpected burst of life, like a flash flood of rain in the dry, cracked desert. Samuel hadn't heard genuine laughter in his cabin since before the graves. The sound of it seemed to physically loosen a tight iron band that had been wrapped around his chest for 6 long years. For the first time, he could take a full, deep breath. 3 days, she said, her laughter subsiding into a warm, hopeful smile. 3 days, he echoed, his own lips curving into a smile that felt foreign, but welcome. The first morning arrived with the pale, fragile light of dawn. Samuel was already gone, a distant figure moving among the cattle. He had left Margaret alone in a cabin that still smelled of his loneliness, of wood smoke and old sorrow. She found the coffee pot, made it just as strong as he liked it, and took a cup out onto the porch. She watched him work. He moved differently with the animals. There was a certainty, a gentleness in his movements. She realized with a sudden clarity that these creatures were all that had kept him sane. They were his only conversation, his only responsibility, his only reason to get up in the morning. After her coffee, she walked out to him, her long shadow preceding her in the early morning light. The cattle, not used to a figure of her size and shape, spooked at first, their heads jerking up, their bodies tensing. But Samuel just kept working, his voice a low, calming murmur, and after a moment, they settled, accepting her presence. "Your hip is worse in the mornings," she stated, watching the subtle wince he tried to hide with every other step. "Always is," he grunted, not looking at her. "Let me work on it tonight," she said. "I wasn't lying. I know bone setting." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her sideways, his eyes narrowed with a mixture of suspicion and hope. "Why would you do that?" "Because," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering, "watching you pretend it doesn't hurt is painful for both of us." That evening, after another simple meal that Margaret had somehow transformed into a feast, she made him lie down on a blanket on the floor. She worked on him for over an hour, her strong, knowing hands probing and manipulating the muscles and tendons around the badly healed joint. She found every knot of scar tissue, every place where the bone had fused wrong, every source of his chronic pain. It hurt like hell. He bit down hard on a strap of leather to keep from crying out, his knuckles white, his body rigid with tension. But he didn't ask her to stop. He trusted her. When she was finally done, she helped him to his feet. He stood up, slowly, tentatively. He took a step, then another. He looked at her, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He was standing straighter than he had in 3 years. The constant grinding pain had been reduced to a dull, manageable ache. "How does that feel?" she asked, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. He shook his head in disbelief. It feels like I've been doing everything the hard way for no good reason. That's most of life, isn't it? Margaret said, a wry, sad smile touching her lips. Doing things the hard way, because we don't know there's another choice. But then, as he took another, more confident step, a dark thought wormed its way into her mind. This man, who had lived with such pain for so long, what else was he hiding? What other truths had he buried under a stoic silence? She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, a sliver of real fear pierced her fragile hope. The stories of his wives, a fever, a woman who walked into a blizzard, another who took her own life. They were all tragedies that left no one to blame but fate. It was all a bit too convenient. What if he wasn't just unlucky? What if he was dangerous? The thought was chilling. He was a man who knew how to live with pain. What if he also knew how to inflict it? The second day, she found him by the graves. 4 simple wooden crosses planted on a low hill overlooking the entire ranch. The names, carved into the wood years ago, were faded and barely legible, slowly being erased by the sun and the wind. He was on his knees, carefully pulling weeds from around the markers, his movements gentle and reverent. The boys were 8 and 10, he said, his voice thick, not even looking up as she approached. He knew she was there. He seemed to always know where she was. William, the older one, he liked to whistle, drove his mother mad. James, the little one, he collected rocks, had names for every single one of them. Margaret knelt beside him in the dirt, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind and the soft, tearing sound of weeds being pulled from the earth. She started on the smallest cross, her large hands moving with a surprising delicacy. "Tell me about them," she said softly. And so he did. For the first time in 6 long years, he spoke their names aloud, not as a curse, not as a burden, but as a memory. He told her about William's gap-toothed grin and James's irrational fear of thunderstorms. He told her how they had both called him Uncle Sam, even though he had raised them more like a father after the cholera had taken their parents years before it came back for them. He painted a picture of a house filled with noise and laughter and life, a picture so vivid that Margaret could almost see it, could almost feel the ghosts of 2 small boys running through the tall grass. "They would have liked you," he said finally, his voice choked with unshed tears. "They would have loved that they didn't have to look up so far to talk to someone. I would have liked them too," she said, her own voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. That night, she made biscuits from his meager supply of flour, and they ate them with the last of the canned peaches. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer the empty, aching silence of loneliness, but the full, comfortable silence of shared understanding. Samuel watched her face in the flickering lamplight, noticing for the first time the way peace had begun to settle in the corners of her eyes, smoothing out the lines of worry and mistrust. "The stage comes tomorrow," he said, the words heavy in the small cabin. "I know." He had to ask. He couldn't let the night end without knowing. "Have you decided?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the last spoonful of peaches in her bowl. She seemed to be weighing her entire life in that single, silent moment. "This morning," she said finally, her voice so soft he had to lean forward to hear her. "This morning, when I woke up, for just a second, I forgot where I was, but I wasn't scared. It was the first time in my entire life that I've woken up in a strange place and haven't been afraid." She lifted her eyes and met his across the table. Her green eyes were clear and deep, and in them he saw his own reflection. "That means something, Samuel, doesn't it?" "It means everything," he breathed. But as she looked at him, a man so thoroughly decent, so broken by grief, A new, more terrifying thought began to take root in her mind. It was about the broker, the man who had written those cruel words. She had assumed it was simple callousness, the act of a man who saw people as livestock. But what if it was more than that? What if it was personal? The broker had seen Samuel, had seen his desperation, and he had seen her application. He had deliberately put the two of them together. The thought was unsettling. Why? What possible reason could he have? It felt like a deliberate act of malice, a cruel joke played on two lonely souls. But the motive eluded her, a dark, shadowy question mark hanging over their fragile, budding hope. As they sat in silence, the weight of the unspoken question between them, Samuel suddenly spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "There's something I need to ask you about that broker," he said, not looking at her. When he came through, he was memorable. Margaret felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. How so? "He walked with a bad limp," Samuel said, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table. "And he carried this fancy cane, with a polished silver handle shaped like a snake's head. Said a horse fell on him when he was younger, crushed his foot." The world stopped. The air in the cabin grew thin, hard to breathe. Margaret's blood ran cold. A man with a limp, a twisted foot, a horse accident. It couldn't be. The world wasn't that small, or that cruel. "What was his name?" she whispered, her voice a strained, fragile thread. "Called himself Jacob," Samuel said. "Odd fellow. Had a way of looking at you like he knew all your secrets." Jacob. The name hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was him, the man from her past, the man who had rejected her, who had called her useful but not beautiful, the marriage broker who had described her as hardy stock, built for labor. It was all the same man. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a random act of a callous businessman. This was a calculated, deliberate act of vengeance. Jacob had seen her application, had seen her desperation to escape a life of being unwanted. And he had seen Samuel's letter, had seen his profound loneliness and grief. And like a master puppeteer, he had taken their two broken strings and tied them together, sending her, the workhorse he had so casually discarded, to the most broken man he could find in the most desolate place he knew. He hadn't just written a cruel advertisement. He had orchestrated a cruel fate. He was trying to prove his point, to prove to the world, and to her, that this was all she was good for. A life of labor with a haunted man in the middle of nowhere. He had sent her here not to find a home, but to be sentenced to a prison of sorrow. The full weight of his cruelty, the sheer twisted malice of it, crashed down on her. Her anger, which had been slowly receding, came roaring back, a tidal wave of righteous fury. "That man," she said, her voice trembling with a rage so profound it shook her entire body. "I know him." And she told him everything. She told him about the town that had paired them off as rejects, the years of unspoken assumptions, and the final, brutal rejection. She told him how Jacob had looked at his pretty new wife like she was the sunrise, a phrase that now tasted like ash in her mouth. As Samuel listened, his own face grew dark, the lines around his eyes deepening into grim furrows. The man who had found him at his lowest point, who had promised him a solution to his loneliness, had in fact been a snake, poisoning his well, using his grief as a weapon against a woman he'd never even met. The injustice of it was staggering. Then, a darker, more terrible piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Samuel's mind. It was about his third wife, the one who had taken her own life. "Margaret," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "There's something else. Something I haven't told you. Something I haven't told anyone." He stood up, his movements stiff, his face a mask of grim resolve. "My third wife, Sarah. The wolves didn't get her. That's just the story I tell. It's easier than the truth." He led her out of the cabin, past the woodpile, to a small, secluded spot behind the barn. There, almost hidden by overgrown weeds, was a single, unmarked grave. It was separate from the others, set apart and alone, even in death. "She took her own life," he said, his voice breaking. "She left a note. She wrote that the silence out here was a living monster, that it was eating her alive." He reached into his worn leather wallet, the one he carried over his heart, and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was yellowed with age and creased from countless readings. He handed it to Margaret. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. Sarah's handwriting was elegant but frantic, the words scrawled across the page. She wrote of the crushing loneliness, the howling wind, the vast, empty sky. But then, at the very end, there was another sentence. "That traveling man who passed through last month, the one with the limp. He filled my head with such terrible stories. He told me this place was cursed, that it drives everyone mad. He told me you were cursed, Samuel, that you were the reason the others died. He said I should run before the darkness took me too." Margaret looked up from the note, her eyes wide with horror. It was Jacob. He hadn't just written a cruel ad. He hadn't just manipulated their lives from afar. He had been here. He had sat in this very cabin with a grieving, vulnerable woman, and he had deliberately, methodically, poisoned her mind. He had whispered his venom into her ear, twisting Samuel's grief into a curse, turning her loneliness into a terror. He may as well have handed her the rope himself. This was no longer a story about two lonely people finding each other. This was a story about a monster who preyed on the broken, who fed on their sorrow, who manufactured tragedy for his own sick sport. He hadn't just tried to write their story. He had tried to end it. They stood there for a long time in the cold moonlight, the damning piece of paper fluttering in Margaret's hand. The full scope of Jacob's evil settled over them, a chilling, suffocating blanket. He was more than a cruel man. He was a predator, roaming the frontier, leaving a trail of broken lives in his wake. How many other Sarahs were there? How many other Samuels? How many lonely souls had he pushed over the edge, their stories ending in unmarked graves, their tragedies dismissed as the simple hardness of frontier life? The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the barn, and for the first time, Margaret understood what Sarah had meant. It did sound like a monster. But the real monster wasn't the silence. It was a man with a twisted foot and a silver-headed cane. The third morning dawned clear and cold. They stood together on the porch, watching the eastern horizon for the first sign of dust that would signal the approaching stagecoach. Margaret's carpet-bag sat by the door, exactly where she had left it 3 days ago. It looked smaller now, less significant. Her hand was in Samuel's. Their fingers were laced together, a comfortable, natural fit, as if they had been holding hands for a lifetime. "I should tell you," Samuel said, his eyes fixed on the distant road. "I don't really know how to be a husband anymore. Maybe I never did." "And I should tell you," Margaret replied, her voice steady and sure, "that I have no idea how to be a wife to a man who actually sees me for who I am." He turned to her, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. "Then we'll just have to learn together." A faint cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, growing steadily larger. The stage was coming. It pulled up in a jangle of harnesses and a cloud of alkali dust, the driver looking down at them with an expectant, weary expression. "You coming, ma'am?" he called out. This was the moment, the final choice. Margaret looked at Samuel, at this broken, beautiful man who had built a cabin with high ceilings just so he could stand up straight. She looked at the hill where 4 wooden crosses stood, waiting for new wildflowers to be planted come spring. She looked at the cabin, a place that had held only one of everything, now waiting to become a home for 2. She squeezed Samuel's hand, then let it go. She walked to the edge of the porch, her back straight, her head held high. Samuel's heart plummeted. He felt the familiar crushing weight of loss settle over him once again. Of course she was leaving. How could she not? She picked up her carpet bag and walked toward the stagecoach. The driver opened the door for her. She climbed the steps, paused at the top, and turned to look back at Samuel one last time. His face was a stoic, heartbreaking mask of resignation, but she didn't get in. Instead, she leaned down and spoke to the driver for a moment, her voice too low for Samuel to hear. She handed him a folded piece of paper and a few coins. The driver nodded, his expression shifting from boredom to surprise, and then to a grim sort of respect. Then Margaret turned around, walked back down the steps, and strode back to the porch, leaving her bag sitting in the dust by the road. She walked right up to Samuel, took his face in her hands, and kissed him. There, in the bright morning light, with the cattle as their witnesses and the ancient mountains as their congregation. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a fierce, passionate kiss, a kiss that sealed a promise, a kiss that declared a war. The stagecoach driver, looking slightly stunned, snapped his reins and drove off, leaving them alone in a swirl of dust. "What was that?" Samuel asked, his voice hoarse when he could finally breathe again. "The paper you gave him?" "That was a letter," Margaret said, a dangerous, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "To the sheriff in the next town. It has Sarah's note in it. It tells him everything. About Jacob, about what he did to her, about what he tried to do to us." She stepped back, her eyes flashing with a righteous fire that Samuel had never seen before. "He wrote about me like I was cattle," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. "So I just branded him for what he is." Samuel stared at her, this magnificent, powerful woman. The broker had told him he needed someone who wouldn't break. But he had been wrong. The broker hadn't sent him someone who wouldn't break. He had sent him someone who breaks things back. The strongest love stories aren't the ones about perfect people finding each other in a perfect world. They're about the broken people, the ones the world has cast aside, who find each other in the rubble and choose to build something new together. They're about healing, one sunrise at a time, one cup of dangerously strong coffee at a time, one long night of holding each other through the darkness at a time. If you were to ride past that small cabin 5 years later, you wouldn't see a lonely ranch. You'd see a home. You'd see 2 rocking chairs on the porch, both built a little higher off the ground than usual, so that long legs could stretch out comfortably. You'd see a sprawling, miraculous garden, full of things that everyone said couldn't grow in the harsh desert soil, all of it tended by 2 pairs of hands that knew how to be gentle with fragile, growing things. And in the door frame, beside the faded pencil marks of the 2 boys who had stopped growing, you would see a series of new marks, carved deep into the wood. Each one was labeled Year 1, Year 2, Year 3, a testament to survival, a testament to love. You'd see 2 people who had learned that sometimes the best love stories start with the worst possible introductions, and that being too tall or too broken or too much for the world just means you were built to stand together, holding each other up against the wind. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that love can see past the cracks and the scars to the soul underneath, then you're the kind of person we want in our community. Hit that subscribe button right now and make sure you ring the notification bell, because every week we share the forgotten stories from the American frontier. Stories of real pain, real love, and real justice. These aren't just tales. They are vital reminders that no matter how tall you stand, or how heavy your past weighs you down, there is someone out there who will see you for exactly who you are, and they will choose to stay. Don't miss our next story. It's waiting for you. Subscribe now and become part of a family that believes the most beautiful things can be built from the most broken pieces.